Are you struggling to create an intentional headspace, unable to connect deeper with yourself? Come, and together let's address the elephant in the room. I'm your host, Sinead Roche, and this is the Uncomfortable Podcast. I'm someone who's quite nostalgic, so I have this big tendency to go back into my archives, look at past photos, look at scrapbooks, just remember old memories that I've had. And I have this big tendency, which many people do as well, to practically think that the past was much better than it actually was. And I think that this feeling usually hits to go back and revisit everything. Sometimes when I'm around persons from my past, and sometimes also when I'm really feeling low and I'm wondering, what's going on around me? Why did I choose the path that I chose? And I think especially when I'm in a new place where I don't automatically feel safe, or it doesn't feel like home, or I just don't understand, if this is the place for me, I start to think, okay, maybe I should go back. Maybe the past was really the best that it was going to get for me. And I really start to miss the familiar. And first of all, I don't think that's a bad thing, but I do think that that's something that we need to talk about. And I think that a lot of people do experience this kind of back and forth with themselves where, especially when they're engaging in new experiences or just things that have a lot of uncertainty, it's like this feeling that you get that tells you that, the past was actually better and you should go back. It doesn't make sense that you took this step to move forward in this way, or to kind of take a leap of faith on yourself. And I think that especially when you're navigating your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, actually just navigating life in general, I think that this feeling will constantly arise. And so kind of to get ahead of it, or to just understand it a bit better so that we can also work with what we're feeling. I think it's important that we kind of just talk about this, because I believe that holding on to this idea that the past was better can hinder us if we don't start to get into this habit of allowing ourselves to feel the emotion, but also letting it pass and not kind of holding on to it. Because I mentioned this is going to be a reoccurring cycle every single time we encounter something new. And obviously the past doesn't have uncertainty because it's already happened. And so naturally, especially when you're trying to find comfort, you're going to look towards things that you already know and are a bit more familiar. But I think that kind of hinders our, progress in the future, and also just the possibilities that are going to surprise us when we engage in new experiences, in new environments. And so let's get ahead of this process in some way. And from my experience, and also looking at what I've seen from other people, what I've heard from other people, I feel like we can get into this habit, especially if you're someone who's usually holding on to things quite often, which I am. We can get into this habit of kind of appreciating things for what they were and not trying to hold on to them. But we'll really get into that as we go through this episode. But naturally, I want to give a kind of a disclaimer, because I know that this is different for everyone. I don't want to say don't return back to familiar, in general, because everyone's situation is different. And I think also it definitely depends on if you were the person who's actively making decisions in your life, or if it's kind of just happening to you. Because when you're someone who has the ability to actually make decisions for yourself and, curate the future a bit more, then sometimes I feel like you kind of think to yourself, okay, maybe I'm using my free will in the wrong way. Maybe the decisions that I'm making, they're actually not in my best interest. And you start to second guess yourself because, like I said, you want to kind of return back to this familiar state. And so I think it's really different depending on person's situations, and what also the past has looked like for them. So this is not to say that if you automatically, return back to what was maybe familiar to you, you're necessarily like harming your growth or harming your potential for more opportunities. No, sometimes that's also exactly what you need to be doing, is kind of taking a step back and like returning back to home base. But I think this is just different for everybody's situation. So with that said, let's get into the episode and kind of talk about, at least for me, when I'm starting to feel like I've made the wrong decisions in my life. It's quite often when things are just, nothing's going right for me. I feel low all the time. Maybe I just have nothing going on for me at that moment. Maybe I'm really bored. Maybe I just miss my friends a lot. And maybe I'm just surrounded by, so many events that hold so much uncertainty for myself that I start to look backwards and I wonder if I should have even done what I've done. And I look backwards and I think to myself, like, that the past was so great. And I don't know why I took this action to kind of like leave and, start with this new beginning or whatnot. And while I don't think this applies to all situations, I do think that sometimes familiarity can become a crutch that we lean on because we're more afraid than anything. And I know that it's really difficult to put yourself in like this new space, put yourself in this new experience, or to kind of just move forward or take initiative in your life in a different way than you've done in the past, especially because there's no like safe ground for you. There's nothing that's like a foundation. And so I think what starts to happen, especially when you start to doubt yourself, is that you build up more evidence, or at least you kind of show yourself a lot of evidence that highlights that, it's not going to get better here. Or it kind of highlights that nothing seems to be working out for you. You start to select these kind of moments that are happening in your life that continue to kind of confirm this thought that you have that you should go back, or that the present just really isn't working out for you. And I think what then starts to occur for many people is naturally you look back and you think, okay, what was the past like? And for many persons, we have this tendency, because you cannot really remember everything as accurate as it actually occurred, but we start to paint the past. And what this kind of phenomenon is, or lots of people talk about it in this sense, we put on these rose-colored glasses where the past experiences that we've had, the past memories that we've made, we start to color them in a really positive way most of the time. Again, this is dependent on the situation. But we start to maybe like erase the moments that were bad and situations that we were in. We start to associate really positive emotions to what the past was, which, for most parts, there are lots of good emotions that transpired, in your past lives. And for me, like, for instance, this weekend, and I wasn't feeling low, so this is a different type of trigger, but just to kind of like have you understand a bit more what this is, like what this kind of phenomenon is. Like this weekend, I spent some time with like my uni friends, like from my old uni. And honestly, at some point I was just looking around, I was like, this is so nice. This is so familiar. And I really miss my friends. I really miss my old house. I lived with two of my closest friends, and I don't know, it kind of did get me thinking, like, why did I leave? Why did I decide to move? And at the same time, like, I know in the back of my mind, as many great moments as there were, because I remember we were like, even this weekend, we were in one of my friend's kitchens and we were like cutting up fruit for this picnic. I remember kind of us being in our old house and, us walking around the kitchen and following each other to like tell stories and whatnot. And kind of this idea of, it was just so great came to me. And at the same time, I can quite clearly also remember there were times we were in the kitchen and it was just so tense. Or we were just having like lots of arguments sometimes. And so I'm telling you this to show you that, like, we have this tendency to paint the past as though it was better than it actually was. And sometimes we can inaccurately like remember certain information. And I think that then kind of like frames our mindset to be like, no, but go back to this safety ground because you remember how good it was. And as we're trying to grow and as we're trying to, seek different experiences and with different opportunities, naturally there comes a lot of uncertainty with that. And so your brain obviously also wants to feel safe again. And so it goes back into these old memories and kind of distorts it in a sense. And I think that's something you just need to be a bit more cautious of, especially when you're trying to make like the certain decision to be like, maybe, for instance, if you move somewhere new, maybe you're thinking, oh, I need to move back because I remember how great that was. But sometimes we're even lying to ourselves about what that was. And now, the reason why I feel like it's really important for us to be able to kind of sit in those moments where we are recollecting and we are, remembering all the great times we've had in the past, is because it's important to remember that, you've had great experiences. It's important to show yourself that like, hey, good things have happened to me in the past. But I think it's also really important, especially when it's occurring when you're feeling really low, when some external event most likely has triggered you and you're starting to believe that nothing's going to get better. I think it's essential that you don't hold on to these, I don't want to say these moments too long, but I don't want you to hold on to this kind of feeling that everything is going to get better if you go back for too long. Because what starts to happen is you tend to then idolize the past and you think that's as great as it's ever going to get. And I think when you also hold on to something for too long, what ends up happening is you kind of ruin the beauty that existed for that time period. Oftentimes, a lot of things are temporary, unfortunately, and fortunately at the same time. And when you're trying to kind of go back into some, whatever that state was in the past, the hard truth is that you can't really recreate what it was. And I think what tends to happen because we're trying to seek this safety, especially in these moments, is that we try to force something and it ends up ruining what even like the beautiful moment was. And I think that even distorts, the past for you once again more. And when you kind of hold on to something for too long, what also ends up happening is that you kind of grow resentful towards that moment because you couldn't let it go and you also couldn't recreate it. And I think that's just something that is a reoccurring theme in life, is that you cannot really go back. And I think we don't just need to let this moment kind of go because if we try to like remain in it or try to recreate it, it will ruin it. But also because if you are someone who's constantly kind of going back and starting to like recreate this habit of going back when naturally the next step is gonna feel a bit weird, it's gonna feel a bit off, and it's going to be a bit uncomfortable with a lot of uncertainty. I think what starts to happen is that you become really avoidant of new possibilities and avoidant of new beginnings, new experiences, and new starts. And yes, a lot of new discomfort that comes with that as well. But I think what's secretly also happening is that you're teaching yourself that you don't even need to give this a chance. And you're teaching yourself that you can't handle whatever is happening to yourself. And you're kind of hindering your own learning at that moment because it got so difficult and you knew that you could just go back to something that was so familiar or you thought you could go back to something that was so familiar that instead of really sitting in the discomfort of this new experience, you kind of, and I don't want to say give up because again, it's different, dependent on different situations, but you kind of took a step backwards. And naturally, if we're trying to grow, if we're trying to kind of move forward in our lives, of course, there's going to be moments that kind of make us reflect and think back to the fact that we had it all, or we had it quote unquote all figured out in the past. And now it just feels like we're again at step one. But how else are we supposed to evolve or adapt and learn more about ourselves, because I think a big part of when you're in these new experiences is just meeting yourself in a different way, meeting yourself in situations you didn't think you would end up in, and situations that really make you confront yourself, which again are naturally uncomfortable. But going back and trying to hide within familiarity, I think that's just something that we think won't hinder us, and we think it won't harm us because it will feel like you're touching base again. But sometimes it's just creating this kind of habit that you have where you don't feel the need to be challenged. And I think that leads to a lot of complacency, but I think that also depends on what your intention is for life and what it is you really want and what you want your life to look like. And as someone who has constantly in the past tried to hold on to what was, and someone who's want to hide and in familiarity and recreate, old memories and old moments, I know how hard it is, especially when it feels like what you're doing right now seems to have no success. It seems that nothing good is happening. And in fact, I quite often reflect on that during this master's program. I reflected on that when I had to move across the country when I was younger. I really just wanted to go back to what was familiar for myself. But as someone who also wants to grow, and I do believe that it's not just for, selective people who you see online where their lives get better when they, stick to the change that they've implemented, but it can also definitely happen to me. I think certain coping mechanisms that I've tried to include into my life, that I'm going to get into in a moment, have definitely helped me to kind of ground myself. I think especially when I'm triggered, and have definitely also just shown me that the moment where I start to feel like I can't figure out whatever is happening right now, it eventually passes. And I think over time, especially as you're creating this new type of life for yourself, you can make one in which you can incorporate things from the past, but you also allow for more space to kind of make these new memories. And I think you start to realize that it kind of does get better. It can get better if you allow it, and if you also give it more time and you give yourself more chances to make it better. And so with that, some of the things that I try to remind myself to do when I kind of want to give up, I want to go back home, or I want to go and move back to, where my friends are from, or sometimes there have been occasions even when I want to go back to the US. First of all, what I try to do is point out the experiences that are going well for me at this moment, because oftentimes you're trying to already confirm to yourself that it's not working out. And so you pick up on all the negative experiences that you're having in all those moments, and you kind of highlight those to yourselves. But quite often, and I've talked about this already in a lot of episodes, especially when we talk about what it means to be grateful, but we're not presenting ourselves with the good opportunities that are happening and the good moments that are occurring in our lives. And I think that's super important to do, especially when you're really questioning, what the fuck am I doing here? I think it's also important to kind of attempt to bring, past activities from your life that have made it feel with, what you wanted it to feel like, that you bring it also forward, so whether that's you were calling up old friends, or whether that's sometimes you even revisiting the old places that you've been, or even old workplaces or whatnot. But maybe it's also just incorporating different activities that made you happy in the past. It's kind of just bringing small moments forward with you, because obviously they made you happy in the past. And maybe it will look different within your life and what that currently looks like, but that doesn't mean that you can't include them, because it doesn't mean that the chapter necessarily had to end fully. I think some things that I also try to do is remind myself, especially when I'm really doubting, is this really going the way that I want it to go? I remind myself why I'm here, why I chose to do what I did if I was the one engaging within the action, and what the intention was, what the goal was, because I know when it takes longer to reach whatever target it is that you want to reach, you start to forget why you're doing something. And so I think it's important also just to have that in the back of your mind, and just remember that you're here for a reason. You chose this for a reason. Maybe you don't want this anymore, and that's something you have to have a conversation with yourself about. But there was a reason for it. You just have to kind of remember what it is, and not so much necessarily everything else that's going on around you and making you feel like shit. It feels like there's no end to this. And some things I do when especially I start to feel like the past was better is I remind myself that the experiences I'm making right now, I cannot equate them to what the past was. I think because especially you have this nostalgic feeling with it, and those, rose-colored glasses, that naturally, even what's positive right now, it won't feel the same in comparison to the experiences that you've had from the past that were positive. And when you can, give the benefit of the doubt to the experiences that you're making right now, it makes you stay a bit more in the present. And I think you don't compare as much, in comparison to what you've had. And lastly, what I do sometimes is, honestly, I just pray, because I know logically that the familiarity that I'm kind of seeking, it's not necessarily where I'm meant to be at this moment. And sometimes I just don't have the answers for myself. So I really try to ask just God, what am I doing here again? When is it going to get better? What do I need to do in order to make it, get better? Because sometimes I'm really not, putting all my actions and efforts into making the life that I want to have. And I think sitting down and asking, a higher being is something that can kind of also take the pressure off of yourself. But that's definitely dependent if you have that type of relationship with God, and if that's something that you seek to have as well. But what I do want you to remember, these are just some coping mechanisms that can help you get through it. And naturally, it's not going to work immediately, and that kind of sucks. But at the end of the day, you need to remind yourself that you owe it to yourself to want more for yourself. You owe it to yourself to want to try a bit more. And you owe it to yourself to think that there are more possibilities for you and that it can get better. And I think a lot of us who doubt that also good things will happen to us, we have this tendency to want to kind of curl back into familiarity, into that safety net. And so sometimes it's really hard that when we're taking a chance on something new, we really do start to doubt ourselves and doubt what we're doing and why we chose this when it seemed to be great where we were at. And so if you're really someone who's doubting yourself right now, and you're sitting down and you're thinking you really want to go back, first thing I want you to ask is, do you think you idolize the past? Because I've done this quite often, and it's really harmed whatever my present was at that moment. And the second thing that I want you to ask yourself was, what was something that has gone well for you recently? Because again, you need to start looking at what's happening to you currently, and you need to shift your focus elsewhere. And I know that's something that is really difficult sometimes, but I think that allows us then to gauge a better sense of control within our lives, and also being able to shift your focus away from everything that you feel like you're missing out on, and really learn to appreciate what you have in front of you, is a skill that allows you to kind of regulate yourself as you move forward in life, and as unfortunately more stressful things start to happen. So note down to yourself, what was something that has gone well for you recently? Because you need to show that to yourself, that there's actual possibilities for positive experiences to still arise, and that the past isn't the only thing that holds them. And with that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I think today was a bit more for me than maybe it was for other people, because maybe I need that reminder. But I hope it was educational in some sense. With that said, I hope you have a lovely day. Bye. Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Uncomfortable Podcast. Make sure to tune in every Monday for a new episode on Spotify and YouTube, and go ahead and check out our TikTok and our Instagram for more content. Bye.